Today, we talk about ArcheoBotany, which is where medieval plants and medieval archaeology meet. Welcome to the Medieval Grad Podcast. It's a podcast brought to you by medievalists.net, where we meet and chat with graduate students and early career researchers to learn about the new trends in medieval studies. I'm Lucie Laumonier, a medieval historian and the podcast host, and today we're talking with Alice Wolff, a PhD candidate in medieval studies at Cornell University in the US. Hello Alice, thank you very much for being here.
Hi Lucy, thanks so much for inviting me.
So Alice, you study archaeology, but not the old stones. Rather, you look at plants and weeds of the past, so you do archeobotany. Can you tell us more about this field of research? What brought you there?
Yes, so ArcheoBotany, also known as paleoethnobotany in the US, is a field of research that has been going on for surprisingly actually a couple centuries now. The earliest example of archaeobotany is from 1826 when Kunth studied plants from a site in Egypt. And we have other remains from the Swiss lake houses that were studied by Oswald here in the 1860s. And the discipline has sort of developed from there. It's become really popular ever since the 1960s, and it's become very commonplace to include methods for collecting archaeobotanical remains into archaeological excavations. And so that's the sort of thing that I study. I personally got into archaeobotany when I was doing my field school, actually, back in 2013. I worked at a site where we uncovered these cereal processing ovens, which are these large ceramic structures or wattle and daub structures that had collapsed and then been buried by soil. So the plant remains inside were charred and preserved, and then the soil kept them intact. So they stayed preserved for hundreds of years, over 1,000 years, and we dug them up my first year at the dig, and I just became fascinated with these charred plant remains and these tiny seeds that survived. And I ended up doing my master's dissertation on those little seeds and looking at what kinds of plants were found at this site.
So my next question is about the sources and the methodology to study the plants of the past. What type of artifacts and sources are available for the study of ancient plants? You just mentioned grains from ovens. I was also maybe thinking about botanical treatises, maybe fossilized plants or food remains in waste pits. What kind of traces of these ancient plants do you have available?
All of the above are really part of the archaeobotanical record. So I mostly work with charred plant remains, specifically seeds. So these are seeds and other plant remains, such as bits of food that have been burned by cooking or by fire in some way. This charring preserves them and keeps them intact even through the deposition into the soil. So a lot of these charred materials do end up in middens and waste pits. So we are looking at food remains in waste pits and things like that. But a lot of contextual information, especially for the medieval period, which is when I work, is found in these botanical treatises like agricultural manuals, which are these handbooks that give instructions on how to grow the best grapes for wine or how to grow the best olive trees for olive oil, things like that.
I have a follow-up question. I'm wondering if you do kind of the scientific analysis of the seeds or remains yourself.
I do. So I can walk you through the process sort of from start to finish.
Yes, I would love that. Yeah.
So I'm involved with a dig at Bamburgh Castle in Northumberland in England, and that's where I do most of my work. So, but this is the way that it works at most archaeological digs that are doing archaeobotanical investigations. So it sort of starts off when we're in the field excavating. You take these bulk soil samples and you can store them or you can process them right away. And usually we process them through a method called flotation, which basically uses water to wash away the dirt. And you use mesh to sort of catch the remains. And the really heavy things like stones and bones and artifacts are left behind in the mesh. The soil falls through the mesh to the bottom of a tank. And the really lightweight stuff, which is what I'm looking at, the archaeobotanical materials, tend to float to the top and you can skim them off with a sieve. So that's sort of what I do when I'm in the field is I'm processing these bulk samples that my colleagues are taking through excavation. And it's when we excavate and we take these samples, we record the exact position within the dig, so that later on we can sort of reconstruct, okay, this was below this, which means that it's probably older, and we can sort of put it into a 3D model of the site. What I do then is I take the material that I've skimmed off from the top of the water, and we call that the light fraction because it's lightweight and floats.
Yeah.
And I take that and I dry it very carefully in mesh bags. Then I weigh it, I measure it, I sieve it, and I take it back to the lab and I look at it under a microscope. And I use that to be able to identify the seeds. So that's sort of the main way that we analyze what we call macrobotanical remains. Macrobotanical remains are things that can be seen with the human eye, like seeds. It might not be easy to see them when you're excavating, but you can see them once you're in a laboratory setting without a microscope. There are other forms of archaeobotany, like starch analysis and phytolith analysis and pollen analysis, that look at microbotanical remains. So those are usually taken with smaller soil samples, and you use chemical treatments to clean them up and form them into slides, put them in slides, and then you can analyze them and sort of see what the different starches or what the different phytoliths look like. But that's not really where in my wheelhouse in terms of expertise.
Maybe one final question about archaeobotany in general would be very basic. What are the applications? Like, of course, we can think about, I guess, history of food or agriculture. What type of crops were there or another site? Are there other things we're not thinking about? Well, climate too, I guess.
Yes. So again, all of the above, really. So archaeobotany is a really hugely varied discipline with a lot of different applications. The primary ones that we definitely use it for are the study of foodways and agriculture. So what crops were people growing? Um, how did those crop choices change over time? How did those crops evolve over time? Things like that. You can also use it to study plant domestication.
Mm.
So this is especially common in areas where domestication happened, and so you'll look at these crops and often take these morphometric measurements of them and see how big they are, and look at how various characteristics developed over the course of domestication. You can also definitely use archaeobotany to reconstruct the environment in the past. So, for example, with pollen analysis, it's very common to use pollen analysis to study how landscapes changed. So, for example, the expansion or contraction of forests,
Mm.
and how many forests there were in an area, how much land was forested, things like that. You can also use pollen to sort of reconstruct climate change in that way, and get some really interesting information out of that. You can also use it to study how people cooked.
Mm.
So there's a really great article that just came out recently that's based actually in the sort of Southeast Asia, and food lumps that you get, which are these charred bits of food. And it was this wonderful study that looked at these food lumps and sort of said, oh, you can tell if this is porridge or if this is bread or how it was cooked, things like
That's
that.
great.
So you can use it to study, yeah, culinary practices as well.
All right. Thank you very much. Let's turn to your current project. So your research looks at the relationships between humans, climate, and plants in a longue durée perspective, that is, over the course of centuries. Your aim, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is to look at the environment and at agricultural practices as influenced by human actions and the climate changes of the Middle Ages. So would you elaborate further? What are you hoping to find out?
Yes, so of course. I don't know how much you want to get into the deep academic dialogue that's been happening over the past few years over the round of role of climate and understanding human history. To sum it up, this is something that's been going on for over 100 years, is this argument that climate is a way to understand why human societies fail or why human societies change over time. Is just that if we understand how the environment changed, then of course we'll understand how human societies changed. This has really become very popular in the last 50 years or so, maybe 60 years, ever since the mid 20th century, because we started developing these climate proxies like dendrochronology, which is the study of tree rings to
Mm.
reconstruct climate. And these paleoclimate researchers love to create these beautiful graphs with lines going up and down, showing the peaks and dips of climate patterns over the course of millennia. And sometimes these charts line up with significant events in human history, which is obviously very exciting for the paleoclimate researchers. And you get these papers that are arguing for sort of the environmental fall of Rome, and this is why the Roman Empire collapsed, what have you. And I don't want to discount climate as an explanatory factor at all in these, especially in these debates. But where I see my research intervening in the current debates is through the use of a more robust theoretical framework to sort of study climate changes in history. So basically, I think that it's a little bit more complicated than that, and we need to think more about human agency in when understanding the relationship between these physical and cultural systems. So for me, I see that the way that we can better understand this is by studying agriculture, because this is where the physical system of climate really intersects with the cultural system of human society through the creation of this phenomenon known as agriculture. And my hope is that by closely studying agricultural change, especially in marginal regions where climate change has a bigger impact, for a period of time where we have so much high resolution climate data, my hope is that we can better understand how climate change might have impacted these agricultural decisions, as well as think questions like how did climate change impact agricultural biodiversity, and understand how that happens over the long term.
I find it really fascinating. Um, so we can maybe dive a little bit more into that. Um, so tell us a little bit more about that. What happened with the climate during the medieval era? How did it change, and how did it impact or not agriculture? How did agriculture evolve too?
Of course. So I work specifically mostly in northern England, but a lot of these trends are sort of broad trends that are present in Europe and generally, and especially in the Mediterranean. So there's a lot of dramatic climate changes that happen throughout the Middle Ages. Starting around 750 CE and going until 1350 CE, you have what's called the medieval warm period, where climate conditions led to warmer, weather conditions. And one of the things that we see in this period, for example, is an increased number of vineyards in England. I believe the Domesday Book records something like 46 vineyards in southern England, but don't quote me on that. So, following that, around 1300 CE, you have something called the onset of the Little Ice Age. So conditions become colder and potentially drier, and it starts to impact agricultural productivity. But throughout this whole period, you're also seeing a lot of really dramatic change, at least in England, in terms of agricultural reorganization. So from the early Middle Ages onwards, you're seeing more of these systems where people are paying tribute and villages are starting to produce specialized goods, agricultural goods that go towards these central locations. We're seeing a lot of technology develop throughout this period, especially based on horses and oxen. And there's a lot of great work that's been done on that. So my hope is to sort of connect this work that we've done on climate conditions with the work that's already been done on how agrarian change has happened. And how do we bring these two things together and understand climate as sort of the context for technological and other sorts of agrarian change?
I'm wondering how the seeds and archaeobotanical artifacts you collect are giving you kind of, concrete, precise information about these agricultural changes.
Sure. So this gets a little bit more into the technical side of archaeobotany. So there's two main, what I call categories of seeds that I'm looking at. These categories are very fuzzy and nebulous in a lot of ways. They blend into one another. And I know some archaeobotanists who think that we shouldn't be using these categories at all. But these are categories for me of crops and weeds. These are definitely socially constructed categories, and crops are I consider crops to be plants that humans are intentionally growing, and weeds are everything that's growing alongside those crops that humans don't necessarily want to be growing there. Um, Working with the definition that a weed is a plant in the wrong place. So the way that I get really specific technical information and detailed information about these agricultural practices and how they change is by looking at these two categories. So the first sort of stage is looking at these crops And I'm looking at species of cereals and pulses specifically when I'm working in Northern England. So I'm looking at what sorts of cereals were being grown, how did those cereals, the categories of cereals, change over time. For example, I actually completed a pilot study last year on my site of Bambara, and or what I found was that Bambara has a lot of wheat in the late Roman period. Then in the early medieval period, crop choices diversify, and you have a combination of wheat, barley, and oat. And then you get a lot of oat. And then as you move into the later medieval period, it switches back, and you have a much more of a focus on wheat. So by looking at looking at samples from all different phases of the site and looking at it throughout the whole stretch of occupation and comparing these different cereals, we're able to start to see patterns in how crop choices change and evolve. The other way that we get technical information is by looking at the weeds. So this is an approach pioneered by people in the UK, but has started to become really common in archaeobotany. And I just released an article about it actually, which is weed ecology methods in archaeobotany. So by looking at the weeds and thinking about functional traits that those weed species have, so things like how tall are they, how much water do they need, do they need nitrogen-rich soils or nitrogen-poor soils, looking at categories like that and looking at that sort of information related to the species found at archaeological sites, you can actually start to reconstruct agricultural practices. So you can sort of say whether like sites were irrigated, or you can say whether crops were sown in the spring or whether crops were sown in the fall, things like that. So it's sort of through the combination of those two approaches in archaeobotany that we can get really detailed information about agricultural practices.
Yeah, and I'm going to say something that might sound a bit weird, but I think, like, besides agriculture, climate, it also gives you kind of very intimate perspective on the landscapes. And like if you were walking near this site in 13 something, you would have seen, I don't know, dandelions, maybe not, but these all these very specific different species. I think it really helps to, I guess, to immerse yourself maybe in the era.
Yes, I think so too. Um, that's sort of why I'm actually really interested in bringing in historical texts that talk about weeds, because there's this phenomenon that botanists nowadays talk about called grass blindness, which is where you see a plant and it's just a plant. You're like, they're
Yeah.
all plants. We can't recognize the difference. And especially these agricultural societies in the medieval period, I think that that's not necessarily true for most people. I think that people would be able to tell the difference between, say, vetch and darnel, whereas I think that most people nowadays would just sort of go, they're all plants.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think this looking at what species are available and thinking very deeply about the species themselves, I think, does give us some insight into medieval perspectives.
Yes, and so let's talk a little bit more about the weeds. You said that they are socially constructed categories, and indeed today, just to quote you, you said that a weed is a plant in a wrong place, which is I really like this definition. How did medieval people perceive weeds?
So this is something I'm still really researching and thinking about. I'm not personally convinced that there was this category that when we translate things from the medieval period as weed, a lot of the time it's actually a very specific word, and they're referring to a
Mm.
specific species of weeds. And I'm not convinced that there's a category in the medieval mind called weed, and that category is necessarily bad or good. Um, One thing that I found that's interesting is that some weeds were considered to be evil or inverted versions of good crops. So, for
Oh.
example, darnel is considered to be an evil variant of wheat, which is really interesting because darnel is still a weed of wheat in developing countries today. And the thing about darnel is that it looks exactly like wheat when it's growing. The plants are extremely similar and pretty much impossible to tell apart until they're fully grown. But darnel is poisonous. It causes blindness if you consume it.
Mm.
And so this is the plant that's actually present in and mentioned by name in the parable of the tares. The parable of tares might be more accurately called the parable of Darnel, which is Matthew 13:24 through 30, where the good man sows good seed in his field, and then an enemy comes in the middle of the night and sows darnel amidst the crop. And when the crops spring up, it becomes clear that there's darnel mixed in with the weeds. And the good man says to his servants to let them both grow, and they'll be sorted out at the harvest time. Um, this is, in my opinion, this is really interesting because when we consider uh, this parable, it's nowadays referred to most commonly as the parable of the tares. But tares is actually a very specific word in Middle English that means vetch, which is a completely different plant. So some scholars have actually argued that the parable of the tares becomes so translated because the church wants to separate out religious and political dissent, and they argue that this parable of the tares and its name dates back to the 1381 Peasants' Revolt, John Wycliffe, and the Lollards, and they argue that it's there's actually a very specific agricultural narrative going on with people recognizing that darnel is an evil plant, and since they dissent from the church, they don't want to be considered darnel. They consider themselves to be vetch, because vetch is actually not a huge problem. It's very visually dissimilar from wheat, so it's very easy to uproot if you don't want it in your field. But it's also edible, and it's also actually a nitrogen fixer, so it actually helps crops.
All right, so there were no clear, maybe, way for medieval people to talk about weeds, but they still removed weeds from their crops, right?
Yes, mostly through plowing. Just repeated plowing
Mm.
is, and or that, or having often children go into the fields to pick the weeds and remove them by hand.
Well, Alice, this was fascinating. I didn't know that archaeobotany was, such a rich field of research. Thank you very, very much for being here today.
Yes, thank you so much again for inviting me. It was great to talk with you about my research.
That was Alice Wolff, a PhD candidate at Cornell. To find out more about Alice, you can go to the show notes. And stay with us because the episode isn't over yet. Let's bring in Peter Konieczny from medievalist.net. Hi, Peter. How are you? What did you think of this interview?
Oh, I love this episode.
Me too.
I'm sure I know this is like, agricultural history and what can you learn from bits of seeds
Yes,
and
chards in a lab
the
with a white coat.
yeah, like it just reflects like a lot of it piece so far in the series of this podcast has been talking about like how scientific research really contributes to what we can learn about the Middle Ages. It's just a perfect example of that. So I was really happy to hear it.
Yes, and I think it's a nice follow-up on the caskets barrels episode. For that exact reason, we're back in a lab learning about long-term trends, using
Mhm.
science, using old residues here, seeds there, just traces on wood. And Alice was also, I think, a very, very good communicator. She really explained very well what she's doing, why, how. So it was really a delight to just record and listen to her.
Yeah, that scientific mind, the person is going off and doing research like on site, like Bamburgh Castle, trying to kind of figure out. Like I really, she's has that clarity, which was really good for an interview.
Yeah, and also what I really enjoyed was all the connections with the current climate crisis and just,
Indeed, indeed.
the history of the environment. It's really very, very trending right now in medieval studies, climate change, how humans adapted to it. It's really very relevant.
Yeah, I thought it's certainly ticking off a lot of boxes in like where we should be doing research, combining kind of different fields. So it was really really fun episode.
Do we have any things connecting to ArcheoBotany on medievalist.net?
I do. There's a
Oh.
piece that we just posted about like less than a week ago, but it's about the rise of wheat and white bread in
Mm.
England. And it kind of happens in the 7th century. And you can see how she's kind of talking about how that part of agriculture kind of declines once the Romans leave, and then kind of is picking up in the like the 8th, 9th centuries, right? And that's it deals with this kind of thing that these Christian missionaries like Augustine of Canterbury and his people were very eager to have white bread for the communion wafer, the
Yeah.
Eucharist, they call it. And that got all these kind of newly converted Christians very interested in having white bread, and you can see it, like, and this is the whole this whole reason that we eat white bread today is because of like this kind of fascination with Mediterranean
Yeah.
cuisine that happens in southeast corner of England in the early 7th century. So yeah, we have the on the piece. I thought that would kind of it really brought me to mind, like when I was kind of listening to the to this podcast, how these things get connected.
Yeah, and you just mentioned Mediterranean cuisine, so we can announce that the next episode of the podcast will be on Byzantine food.
A tasty one indeed.
A tasty one. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thanks.
You are listening to the Medieval Grad podcast brought to you by medievalists.net. You can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcast, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and leave us 5 stars and a good review. Thank you. Of course, if you want to support us a little bit more, you can subscribe to our Patreon, patreon.com/medievalists. You can get a lot of great benefits on Patreon, including being able to hear the show episodes early. We love doing the podcast and really appreciate your help. I'm Lucie Laumonier. You can find me on Instagram at The French Medievalist. Thank you very much for tuning in. Au revoir!